Can you do a tier list / guide on each character's best elemental reaction? That's actually kind of an interesting thing, yeah. Zajef daily ask question, man. It is. It is. It is. But I mean, I don't mind. It's interesting content. So, Hyper Bloom, Vape, Melt, Quicken. I'm gonna keep Spread and Aggravate in the same one because otherwise it's kind of cringe. Chad, don't say hi to Jeff Daily. Don't say hi to an unofficial clip channel. Come on now. Bruh. Brumuggus. Ain't no way. He's a Jeff Daily, true. Are there even, I guess, yeah, Freeze? Swirl? There's no such thing as a Swirl team, you know? Like, yeah, it is indeed a reaction, but it's not a reaction that has teams. So I'm not going to include it. Taser? I don't know if there's any character whose best team is Taser, you know? Taser's just one of the teams you can do. But I guess we can have it. Beidou? I don't know if her best team is Taser. I don't think so. Sucrose? Sucrose would go into none. She has too many teams where she's good. None / many. Right? Where, like, there's no one team that stands above the rest. Alright. Let's start with Jean. None / many. Jean is just an Animo healer. She kind of fits anywhere where you need an Animo healer. Yeah, that's actually a good idea. None in a good way. None in a bad way. Alright. Lisa, probably Quicken. I think Lisa Hyperbloom is incredibly fucking cope. She is pretty bad in Hyperbloom, but she is actually a pretty decent option in Quicken. She can either be, if you're using Dendro units that generate enough particles, she can be a like solo Electro option for Quicken teams that don't need, that just don't really have a lot of good Electro options right now. Like, spread teams just, they can't really use Fischl too well. And Solo Electro Beidou tends to have ER requirements that are too high for her damage to really be relevant. And so, at that point, it's basically, you can go Lisa if you need the Death Shred, and Beidou if you need the shield, right? So I think she's actually a pretty decent option in that. And she's also a pretty decent option if you just want to play Lisa Aggravate. Amber, none in a bad way. I mean, I guess I think you could make an argument for Amber and Vape. But like, if she's literally just there to apply Pyro so you can VV, not even to actually trigger a reaction or give a buff, then I don't think it really counts. Noelle. I guess I should add Mono Geo, right? Or I guess Mono teams. But the thing is, it's not even her best team. Her best team is with Farina now, right? But it's kind of a Mono team. Like, it's not a reaction team, you know? Mono / inert reactions. Like Crystallize and Swirl. Isn't Mono just none in a midway? None means that you're played in a lot of different teams. So no. Triple Geo plus Farina? Yeah, Triple Geo plus Farina, kinda. Barbara. Barbara is actually very comfortably in Nilo. She's pretty bad in most teams. Oh, she's not even that bad. Like, she's fine. It's just, she's generally not better than the other options you can put in the slot, right? And in Nilo teams, she is actually pretty decent. Her most direct comparison is Kokomi, right? And compared to Kokomi, you have a little bit more brainless gameplay. You don't have to refresh your jellyfish, right? And you can actually move with your Hydro application. And in exchange for that, your AoE is smaller, and that's basically that, right? So, but she is actually a pretty reasonable option for Nilo teams. So yeah, that's that. Sucrose! Not in a good way. Sucrose is good in too many fucking teams. Fischl! I think Fischl goes pretty comfortably in Quicken as well. She's pretty good. She is also good in Taser, but I would argue that she's actually a lot better in Quicken than in Taser. Fuck, she's necessary for basically most aggravate Quicken teams. Right? But yeah. Mona goes in Freeze. But like, I don't think Mona is very good. I've never thought that Mona was very good. But I do think that she's a lot better in Freeze than in other teams. So I think she should be here. Kaeya! Okay, chat. Listen. Okay? Listen. Hear me out, okay? Unironically, alright? It's between Freeze and Hyper Fridge, right? But I think that in most situations, he's not really good enough in Freeze teams to really be one of your main options. Whereas in Hyper Bloom teams, he's actually really good. His high particle generation, relatively short animations, and damage that is actually really good if you kill enemies with a C2. He's actually just really good for Hyper Fridge. It makes me sad, right? Because, like, I wish he was better in other teams. And he's not completely terrible in Melt, right? And he's not completely terrible in Freeze. But honestly, any decent off-field cryo is just so good in Hyper Fridge. Hyper Fridge is just so comfy to play. I love Hyper Fridge. Diluc! So, Diluc technically has a decent team. Technically. Right now, he technically has a decent team. It's Dragon Strike. It's Omega fucking cringe to play, but it is actually a decent team. And at worst, you can still play the same teams as Dragon Strike and not do Dragon Strike and just use your burst and skill and a few autos. And it's fine. But I don't know if those teams are really good enough to place him there over Burgeon. Like, if you force me at gunpoint to play Diluc, I would not have fun playing him in Melt. I could have fun playing him in Burgeon. Although now that I think about it, Kaeya can be pretty good in Oven as well. So maybe Kaeya goes here. Even though he's not as good as a character like Sucrose, maybe he does. Should we have Burgeon or Melt for Diluc, chat? I think I'm gonna put him in Burgeon. Razor! Burgeon, and it's not even close. Bennett! Not in a good way. For sure. Ningguang! It's Navia teams. Beidou! None in a good way. Keqing is Quicken. But you do have to add the asterisk that she's pretty good in the Quick Bloom teams, which are a mix of Quicken and Hyper Bloom. But she leans more towards the Quicken side than the Hyper Bloom side. Like, you don't really want to play her in Hyper Bloom teams that are not Quick Bloom. And you can actually play her in Quicken teams that are not Hyper Bloom. Xiangling! This is actually difficult. Because I don't think she can really go in none. But also, maybe she has to, because she's... Monopyro's not real without her, you know? And Monopyro's good. She's also really good in a lot of Burgeon teams. Xiangling herself prefers the vape teams for her damage. I mean, you could say Mona prefers vape teams for her damage. Like, her damage isn't the only thing that matters. I think she has to go here. Because I don't think you can really reasonably say that her vape teams are significantly better than her non-vape teams. Chongyun! Xingqiu! Definitely here. Qiqi! Here. Venty, he's like in between these two. Because like, you look at the other characters here, and the reason they're there is because they're necessary for a lot of different teams. Venty's not necessary for any team, right? He doesn't really have particular synergy with any team other than, like, Morgana, but, like, that's kind of right? But he doesn't need to have synergy with a team to be the best option in a team for a given piece of content. Yeah, I think he goes here. Klee! I think with the release of Furina, Klee goes from mono to vape. I've always struggled to recommend Monopyro Klee because it's always just been like, what's the point of playing her over the other options in Monopyro? Like, what do you gain from it? Not that you can't do it, just that I've always felt that it was kind of like, whatever. In Furina teams, I actually do see it, though. Although it is a forward vape team rather than a reverse vape team, but still. It is funny that the first character in vape goes for forward vape, but hey. It is what it is. Second character is also vape, though. So second character in vape here, and then that is, yeah. That's not, yeah. Diona! As much as I don't like Diona, I think she goes here. Because while she doesn't really have insane synergy with any team, she is actually a reasonable defensive option in a lot of different teams, right? Like, she's a reasonable defensive option for Cryo. She's a reasonable defensive option, or sorry, for Freeze. She's a reasonable defensive option, and offensive option for Diluc's Melt teams. She's a reasonable defensive option for Hyperfridge. Overall, I think she's fine. And I don't think she's good enough in Freeze to be here compared to her other teams. Zhongli, also none in a good way, that's for sure. Xinyan, fortunately, is going to be none in a bad way. I mean, I guess you could make the argument to put her here, right? Because she's not complete garbage in Monopyro. She's also not good in Monopyro, so, like, I think it goes here. Albedo. Mono/inert reactions. You do have Ning in there anyways. I think Ning is actually a reasonable option in Navia teams, though. Ganyu. Ooh, that one's hard. I'm gonna be honest. I don't fucking know where she goes. I think it's here. Ganyu's pretty good in Hyperfridge. And as much as Melt Ganyu is inherently omega fucking cringe, it is situationally pretty good. I don't really like Freeze Ganyu anymore. And I think Monocryo, or Ganyu in Monocryo is pretty decent. Was a good Hyperfridge team for Ganyu minus bench, and I'd like to start playing her again. Any core, like any Hydro, Electro, Dendro core you want to play for Hyperloon, you can put Ganyu in. I guess with the release of Furina, you can actually on-field Ganyu in Hyperfridge. I've never thought about that before. But I guess you could. Who will heal Furina? You can use Beidou as your Dendro or Qiqi as your Electro. I don't think either of those are, like, ideal, but it is a thing you could do. Or you could straight up just do no healer Furina. And basically be using Furina because she's a Hydro option that doesn't require normal attacks. Probably would not be fun to play on-field Ganyu with fucking 8k HP all the time, though. But hey. Good luck. Xiao! Mono/inert reactions. Hutao! Vape. Rosaria! Not in a good way, like Kaeya. She's pretty usable in Freeze, Melt, Hyperfridge, Oven. Yeah, she's fine. Yanfei! I think she actually goes in Vape. Never been a fan of Monopyro with Yanfei. And unlike Amber, whose only Vape team is when you're using her as the Pyro for Hutao, she can also just straight up be played as a vape carry, even if she's not particularly great at it. She's fine. So I think she goes in vape. I don't want to do this character. We're gonna do Kazuha. None in a good way. Ayaka. Oh, God. Chat, you guys aren't gonna like me for this. She goes here. She's not in freeze. She has freeze, mono cryo, and hyper bloom, and she's pretty good in all three. I'm sorry, that's just how it is. I'm sorry, I don't make the rules. I do make the rules, but I am sorry about that. Yoimiya! I think none in a good way as well. I think you need to put them in the best team, the team that can realistically perform the best. There's too many characters are in the none in a good way. I disagree. The whole point of this is like, the characters that are here, it means that you can reasonably play them in a bunch of different teams that will all be good. The characters that are not here, they have one team that will perform significantly better than the others. So if you like them and you want to play them, you should probably play them in that team if you want to have good results. And you can make the argument that characters like Hutao are good enough that even when you play them in a non-optimal team, like even when you play Hutao in Mono Pyro, it's still good. But like, I do think there's enough of a difference to justify it. But Ayaka doesn't have a bunch of teams. I mean, Freeze, Mono Cryo, and Hyper Fridge are all pretty different teams that use pretty different characters. Like, Freeze and Mono Cryo have a lot of overlap, but Hyper Fridge doesn't. You have one unit of potential overlap, and the other two units cannot really be played in her other two good teams. I don't disagree those characters are versatile, but I feel they have optimal teams. I feel like if Abysses were anti-freeze less often, I could find myself in agreement with your point. But I think there's way too many Abysses that are designed to fuck over freeze for Ayaka to really be a character that you should consider as freeze only. I think if you want to be an Ayaka main, unless you have the fucking money and or saved up primos to get Ayaka, maybe some constellations and her signature weapon, and all of the optimal characters for freeze, it's probably a good idea to also have a Hyper Bloom team at the ready. Otherwise, there's going to be a bunch of Abysses where you're going to struggle to clear with her. Like, I think Ayaka Hyper Fridge is actually a very good team. I think it's not just a good Ayaka team, it's also a good Hyper Bloom team. Like, I think it's actually a good Hyper Bloom team. And it's really fun, true. It's good this Abyss second half. It's good this Abyss either half. It's good first and second half. But you're right, it is good second half. Is she not viable in Oven? She is, but Oven is a little bit more reliant on off-field cryo than Hyperfridge. But she definitely is still viable in Oven, don't get me wrong. Sayu! I think it's got to be none in a bad way. I mean, okay, maybe it's not in a good way. I don't know, man. I don't like Sayu. Like, it's just... Sayu feels so cringe to play. Whether you're using her as a gene replacement, or you're trying to use her fucking coggers as a source of damage, it just doesn't feel good. But not everyone has Gene, and like having a 4-star that does something similar to what she does is still good. And her teams aren't bad, they just feel bad to play. But I think she has to be here. Raiden! I am fighting the urge to put her in Hyper Bloom. I really am. I am fighting it so much, but I think she should be in none. Well, I do think that Hyper Bloom tends to be generally slightly above her other teams. She also has enough teams that are good enough, right? Like, she has just her normal Hyper teams. She has Rational. She has Aggravate. She has Quick Bloom. Yeah, the difference isn't that big. Yeah, she also has the Chevreuse teams now. I could have a category for Chevreuse, but I don't think anyone would end up in there. I don't think any character is like significantly better in Chevreuse teams than in other teams. The problem with Raiden Hyper Bloom is 1 can't proc on shield, 2 can miss blooms on the ground if target is airborne. I mean, the first problem doesn't matter. Why does it matter that you can't proc on shield? When do you need to apply Electro to shields? What shield is weak to Electro? It doesn't matter. No team does damage while enemies are shielded. You're breaking the shield. And Electro's not an element that tends to be particularly useful for shield breaking anyways. So it doesn't really matter that much. Like, it would be a little bit better if it could proc on shield, but I don't think it's nearly as big as a problem as you make it out to be. Shields are affected by damage? I mean, yes and no. Like, yes, shields are affected by damage, but if your shield is squishy enough that the damage on it is going to be significant, you can break your shield without the damage from Hyper Bloom. And if it's not, if it's too tanky, then you're going to need some other form of shield breaking anyways. Plus, if they are squishy enough for it to really matter, you can use your burst. You don't need to build ER if you only burst against shielded enemies. And then you can miss blooms on the ground if target is airborne. That is fair. The reality, though, is that there's just not that many targets that are airborne in ways where you can generate a lot of seeds on them and need to need Raiden's E to proc them. And again, you can solve that issue for the time enemies are airborne with Raiden's ult. Like, you're right that it is a downside, but it's just not that big of a deal that often. It's only a problem when we not on the Wolf Lord. Yeah. And like, even on those enemies, your alternatives have different issues that are also a problem, right? When the enemy moves a lot, with Raiden, that doesn't matter. With Qiqi, you have to move to follow them. And like, don't get me wrong, it's not that big of a deal either. But the point I'm getting at is just, there is that downside, but it's not actually that insanely significant. But anyways. Sara is mono / inert reactions. Kokomi, not in a good way, for sure. Kokomi's good in a lot of teams. She's good in mono, she's good in taser, she's good in bloom. She's good in freeze. Alloy! Toma! So the thing about Toma is, I'm not sure if he goes in none. I guess so. It's not our Burgeon. Because, like, even though I think he only has really one team where he's a premium shielder, it is enough. Almost no one uses Toma as a shielder. Do Wonder Remains not use Toma as a shielder? They do? I mean, that's the impression I got. Because, like, Toma is a good shield option with Wanderer. Obviously, I can't know for sure what people actually use, and a lot of the time, they don't use the optimal thing. So him being good there doesn't mean he's actually used there often, but like, I think they do, no? Yoimiya mains too? Yeah, that's fair, I guess. Hutao and Risley can also use him. Risley I like, Hutao I think it's cope. Like, it's fine, but the main upside of a defensive option like Toma in Hutao teams is that you become less reliant on the resistance to interruption from Xingqiu, but Toma's pyro application makes you lose vapes unless you have C2 Yelan, if you're using Yelan as your Hydro. So I don't actually like Toma too much with Hutao. It works, like it is a thing, but I don't know if I'd include it in his better teams. Toma's good with Wander, I didn't know that, skill issue. He's the only good Burgeon unit? He's not. I don't even know if he's the best Burgeon unit. I don't think so. I'm pretty sure Bennett Burgeon teams are just almost always better. Because with Toma, you have to choose between getting a good healing option or getting Nahida. With Bennett, you can always use Nahida. But you need to use Bennett Burst for it. I mean, yes. It is indeed often better to use characters Burst than to not. I'm not entirely sure what point you're trying to make. You're making the point it's low uptime, but it's not. Like, it can be low uptime, well, low-ish uptime, but when Bennett is your Burgeon trigger, you can just use your burst on him every 15 seconds. And your uptime is really good. You're trying to point out the problem in infusing with Kazuha's... Why would you do that? Why would you play Bennett Burgeon with Kazuha? Ew. Don't get me wrong, it's not terrible, but like... Bennett Burgeon with Kazuha is very much a AoE-only team. right? It's pretty dog shit in single target. Whereas oops. And like, yeah, it's not the highest single target damage team in the game, but it's pretty good. With Kazuha, it's just a lot more scuffed. And then you can also just do oven variations and good without C6? No, not really. In general, don't try to play Bennett Burgeon teams without C6. They're not great. You have to sacrifice his EM for ER? No, you don't. You would in the Kazuha team, yes. But in this team, you definitely do not. You do many, many E's per rotation. On top of that, all of your EM main stat pieces can't get EM substat, and the only other stat you care about is ER, so it's not that hard to get a decent amount of ER. I wanted to Bennett burst, but it's fine. Yeah, we miss a bit more seeds from him going up at the wrong moment here, but it's still like decent, right? Or you can just play strict Burgeon with a second Hydro unit. The heal is also a lot better than I thought. Yeah, Bennett... There's a reason why pre-Farina, Bennett's best build was ER Pyro Crit. Because he just doesn't need healing to heal. He just heals. Holy shit, Master Plan? Yeah, Master Plan is fucking banger. I don't like this team as much because you're kind of wasting your double Hydro in a team like this, in my opinion, but like, it's not bad. Hey, we got lucky twice in a row. It's kind of nice.
I see everything. Witness the power. Game's up. Fun's over. Gotcha. I'm going in. Know my soul. Let's light it
up. Bro stealing my Doritos and PMA, true. But yeah, so all this to say, Bennett Burgeon teams are good. Total Burgeon teams are also good, but they tend to be less good if you have to run a healer. because of the lack of great synergistic healer for Burgeon outside of Bennett. I've never seen a leveled halberd. It's the best looking weapon in the game, which is why I leveled it. But yeah. Anyways, let's show a team with this. But yeah, so if you're not running a healer to compensate, right? Then Toma lets you like drive on Nahida. Oops. Which does tend to lead to slightly faster clears. Alright, it's about as fast as the one with Bennett here because of HP breakpoints, but it's a little bit more DPS, right? But when you're using a character like Beidou or Yao Yao, it isn't as good. My Yao Yao might not be on Deepwood, actually. I hope she is. You can like pretty noticeably see the damage difference. And this isn't bad, right? Like, this isn't terrible damage. It still clears more than fast enough. But it is slower. So basically, the main upside of Bennett in Burgeon teams is that you don't need another healer. With Toma, you can get away without a healer with like Proto Ember. But effectively, damage you take is permanent, right? Like, you're not really gonna out-heal. Like, Proto Ember is basically enough to break even with your Burgeon self-damage, more or less. And then anything past that is like... the damage you take is gonna be staying. So if you can generally get away with playing healerless teams, you'll be fine with Proto Ember, Nahida, and Toma teams. And then I think it's fair to say that Toma's a slightly better unit than Bennett in those teams. But otherwise, Bennett is just better. Either way, they're both pretty good. Ito! Mono inert reactions, alright, next. Goro! Mono inert reactions, alright, next. Shenhe! I think it's not in a good way. Because you kind of have both mono and freeze. Although I think you could make a stronger argument here that like those teams are kind of too similar. Honestly, I think I'll do freeze / mono cryo and just put her here because the teams are similar enough. Yunjin, I don't know, none? Question mark. Like, she's only really in Yoimiya teams, but Yoimiya teams can be vape or inert. Yeah, it's like none in an okay way, but I don't want to add a category, so I'll just put her in none in a good way. Kara, like, okay, she's fine in Wanderer teams as well, but it's just, I don't know. I'm not a fan of her in Wanderer teams because Wanderer teams tend to not generate a lot of energy, which makes Yunjin feel a lot worse in those teams. Yai! So, if you asked me about Yai like a week ago, I would have said Quicken. That being said, I did really like the Yai Chevreuse teams. I did. I think they're actually pretty good. So she might go in none in a good way. I think Chevreuse opened up her team options enough. It's basically... the fact that she inherently has anti-synergy with Bennett makes it so that if you want to run a Chevreuse team with Fischl Xiangling, she just is one of, if not the best option for the last slot. And those teams are pretty strong. Why anti-synergistic? Yeah, because she doesn't snapshot. And she's an off-fielder who doesn't snapshot, right? Which means that she doesn't really... unless you actually on-field her, which doesn't tend to be a thing you really want to do with her, you will only have Bennett's buff on part of your damage. Raiden clears Yai on that slot. I don't think I would say that she clears Yai. I think Raiden is also good, but I think Yai is maybe underrated in the slot. I'm gonna put it here. Ayato goes not in a good way. As much as people like to shit on Ayato now, he's still not bad. Like, yeah, he's generally a downgrade to Neuvillette, but Neuvillette is a good unit. And he's still good in a lot of those teams. I think there's an argument to be made that he's better in Nilo teams than in other teams. I think that's a fair argument to be made, but I don't know. I think he's good enough in other teams not to be there. Yelan, none in a good way. Kuki, a Hyper Bloom. Now, Kuki is also good in Quicken. I don't think she's great in Quicken. I think that she's just the only option in Quicken for defensive Electro, but which makes her just inherently a popular option for Quicken. But I think there's a lot more room for replacements in the Quicken slots than the Hyper Bloom slots. Who the fuck is Dory? Yeah, exactly. Hazo! I mean, not really. It's kind of like none in a good way. Like, he's kind of like Cope Sucrose, you know? They're gonna put someone in Taser. I don't think anyone's gonna be in Taser, honestly. Hazo is Navia, but bad if you think really hard. To some extent, kinda. Tichnari will go in Quicken. Again, much like Keqing, he is actually a pretty decent option in Quick Bloom teams, but he leans more on the Quicken side than the Hyper Bloom side. Klee, I think, goes in none in a good way. As much as I am personally a big Klee hater, she is actually a reasonable option in Quicken teams and in Nilo teams. Maybe she's better enough in Nilo teams. Yeah, I think she might be better enough in Nilo teams that she should be here. Dory. So here's the thing about Dory. Dory from C0 to C5 is one of the worst units in the game. Dory at C6 is actually a pretty good unit. She's kind of like Farazan. C6 Dory is good for the same reason why carry Bennett is good. Because role consolidation is really good. Especially with the release of Farina. Dory is just a good carry now when you have her at C6. I think pre-Farina, she was kind of whatever. But there was no reason why you needed a lot of healing in your teams. No reason why you couldn't just use Kuki as your healer. Now, Kuki's healing isn't enough to get a lot of fanfare stacks from Farina. And so, if you want to play an on-field Electro unit, you're generally going to have to choose, well, I want my Electro, I want Farina, I want Nahida. The last option kind of has to be like Beidou, right? Ideally. Playing Dory lets you replace Beidou for Fischl. And you lose damage from your carry, because Dory's damage isn't as good as the dedicated Electro carries. But Fischl does a lot more fucking damage than Beidou, you know? And so it actually makes it so that the team is competitive. I don't know if I would call those teams Quicken or Hyper Bloom, though. I think they lean more towards the Quicken side. Gilded or Flop, Thundering Fury. Sino, I think, goes in none in a good way. I think Sino has reasonable Quicken and Hyper Bloom teams and some amount of weird Burgeon stuff. I think that there's a fair argument to be made that most of his best teams include some form of Hyper Bloom, but they also don't focus nearly as much on the Hyper Bloom reaction itself as most of the actual Hyper Bloom dedicated teams. So it's difficult for me to like be confident in putting him in Hyper Bloom. Yeah, this one's not hard. Okay, Nilo. I wonder. Nahida. Yeah, that's not hard. Lila goes in none in a good way as well, for sure. Wanderer. I think it's gonna be an inert / mono. You can play Hyper Bloom Wanderer and stuff like that, but I think his mono teams are generally the best ones. Farazan, also, same thing. Alhaitham. Alhaitham has to go in none in a good way. He has two, like, main good teams and one reasonable team, right? So mainly his Quicken teams and Hyper Bloom teams, and reasonably in Nilo teams. I wouldn't be able to choose between Quicken and Hyper Bloom though, so he goes in none in a good way. Yao Yao. I think it's fair to say that Yao Yao's best team is Nilo. She's also fine in Burgeon and Hyper Bloom, but her lower Dendro application does make it like suboptimal. You still get, like, she's still a reasonable option if you need a healer, right? But the team will generally perform worse than if you were able to slot Nahida with Proto Amber in, right? She's also pretty good in Quicken, but I think she performs better. Actually, yeah, I think she's a better building block for Nilo teams than other teams. Daya, don't laugh. Don't laugh. Don't laugh. Don't laugh. In my opinion, Kaeya has one good team, and it's the Nivulette Hyperbloom team, where she's used to give him vapes. I think it would be fair to argue that she has two good teams, that one and as a defensive option for teams that want a pyro defensive option, like Linny, or to some extent Wanderer, even though I do think she's almost always a downgrade to Toma in there. And I guess kind of Burn Melt Nilo. But I think she's a co-op options in basically all of those teams. Whereas she's actually a great option for Nivulette's Hyperbloom teams. I don't know if it's really fair to even call it a Hyperbloom team, because it's a Vapor Bloom team, basically, you know? Did I say Burn Melt Nilo? My bad, I meant Burn Melt. You know what I meant. Burn Melt Ganyu, Burn Melt Risley, whatever. She has nothing to the Hyperbloom? I mean, sure. She adds a lot to the team, though. It's not Hyperbloom as a whole. It's a Hyperbloom team. Mika. Mono/inert. Beidou, I think, is done in a good way. Farida's release, in my opinion, has given him a lot more teams where he's a more reasonable option. And has changed him from being, in most relevant situations, a downgrade or side grade to Yao Yao, to actually being an upgrade to Yao Yao in some teams. Kaveh! He's not good in Bloom. He's not good in Hyper Bloom. He's not good anywhere, man. Saj. Kirara goes not in a good way. I think she's about as good in Nilo teams and in Quicken teams. Linny, very obviously in mono/inert reactions. Although technically you can play him with Farina and Vape is there. But like, yeah. Yeah. Lynette. I mean, looking at the characters that are in None in a bad way, I wouldn't put Lynette there. So I guess she's None in an okay way, right? Kind of like Hazel. Femine. Is it reasonable to put him in Hyperbloom? He does have synergy with Hyperbloom. But the Hyperbloom teams tend to be about as good if you just don't swap into him and play a 3-unit Hyperbloom team. Which isn't good. Make a new tier Hyperbloom in a bad way? Man. Honestly, sure, instead of Taser. Okay, Nivulette is good in a lot of teams. Risley is actually also good in a lot of teams. Right, Risley has Melt, Freeze, Mono Cryo, Hyper Fridge, Burgeon by Marie. He's got his options, you know? Farina. Also None in a good way. I think that's pretty straightforward. Charlotte. Freeze/Mono Cryo. You can also play her in Hyper Fridge, but I don't think there's much of a reason to over other options. Navia goes in Mono/inert. Chevreuse, and I don't know how much of a hot take this is, but in Chevreuse teams, Overload is an inert reaction. Overload in Chevreuse teams does as much for the team as Crystallize in Mono Geo team or Swirl in Mono Pyro teams. It's just there to be there. It's not actually changing anything. You're not actually caring about the reaction. You care about the fact that you trigger it, you don't care who triggers it because it doesn't fucking matter. It's not the reaction that helps, it's the fact that it procs her passives. Cloud Retainer. Chongyun. None in a good way. Gaming. None in a good way with an asterisk. I think he's generally better in Vape teams, but at higher con, I think he's a lot more viable in Melt teams as well. So I guess we didn't put anyone in Melt. Well, that's okay. Put Ella with Femine. I don't think she goes there. Unironically, in my opinion, with Farina's release, if you want to play Ella, it's fine to play her in physical teams. You're not necessarily going to have better results with Hyperbloom anymore. And so the reason why I struggle to place her somewhere is because I think that, like, realistically, her best synergistic team is overall about as good as her Hyperbloom team. But I don't want to put her in None in a good way, because it's not like she's good in the Hyperbloom team, right? Like, the Hyperbloom team exists whether or not she does. Right? Like, she'd be here in terms of the Hyperbloom team. But I think that unlike Femine, she is actually decent outside of the Hyperbloom team. But not so much that it's a significant upgrade to the Hyperbloom team. Right? So, like, I feel like putting her there is actually, like, slightly slanderous. But putting her here is misleading. You know? So I'm just not gonna place her. Whatever. Who cares? I make the rules.